Well, hello and welcome back to the introduction to the New Testament. We're still in the Gospel of Mark today, but we are, now that we are 4 weeks in to the Gospel of Mark, we're almost done with the first half of the book. You may remember that when we started the Gospel of Mark, we talked about how Mark's Gospel was much shorter than the other three, and Mark's Gospel was primarily divided into two sections. The first is the life and ministry of Jesus. The second half of Mark's Gospel is about the final week of Jesus. What we have already discussed is called the Passion narrative, having to do with his betrayal, arrest, his death upon the cross, and the resurrection on Sunday. And so that will be the focus of the next half of the videos that we will put together over the next several weeks this fall. But for right now, what I want to do is to finish up the last few chapters of Mark's first half of the gospel. And we're going to enter in at chapter 9, verse 2. Now, you may remember from last week's message, we focused at the end upon the disciples talking about who Jesus is at Caesarea Philippi, up in the northern part of Israel. We discussed how they were asked by Jesus, "Who do people say that I am?" And they were saying John the Baptist, Elijah, and all these other prophets, somebody like that, reincarnated in some form or fashion. But when Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" it's Peter who says, "You are the Messiah, the promised one of God, the one that was going to be cut from the cloth of the kings of old, like King David, King Solomon, the ones who had built the temple, the ones who had led faithfully, for the most part, over the people of Israel when they were their own nation, when they had their own own land. They had their own rule over their worship and the life of the people there. That wasn't the case at the time of Jesus. They were under Roman rule. They did not have full access to every part of their life together as God's people. So, in this sense, that's where we left it off last week. In chapter 9, verse 2, we see that we jump ahead about 6 days. And we find that Jesus and his disciples have moved quite a far ways away to the other side of the Galilee. And at this point, what they're doing is that a few of them have gone up on a mountaintop with Jesus. And this is a really significant story from Mark's gospel, from the gospels itself, and it's a really good follow-up to what just happened at the end of chapter 8. So let me read chapter 9, verse 2 and following. This is called the Transfiguration of Jesus. This is, again, 9, verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. So, interesting story, isn't it? That right after Jesus and his disciples were talking about who do people say that he is, Elijah and Moses, who wasn't in that last discussion, but Elijah was, about who Jesus might have been, meets with him on a mountaintop. Why these two people? Well, these are important people in the life of Judaism, in the life of the people of Israel. You see, it was Moses who went up high on a mountain and encountered God, and he was the one who wrote down the commands of God. Think about the 10 Commandments, about how Moses went up the mountain, Mount Sinai. He talked with God, he brought down the tablets, and he found the people worshiping a golden calf. And what did he do? He dropped the tablets, broke them. All of the terrible things that happened after that, he has to go back up to the mountain and get the Ten Commandments yet again. So Moses is an important figure as the giver of the law, the leader of God's people, along with Aaron, out of captivity in Egypt, where they eventually, again without Moses because he passes away, get into the promised land. So he is a giver of the law. He is a partner with God in the deliverance of the people. He's an important figure in the life of Israel. And, of course, he encountered God on a mountaintop. Elijah did too. Elijah was up on a mountaintop when he encountered God and heard the still small voice of God. Not many people have encountered God, let alone on a mountaintop. So here's Jesus. They're on a mountaintop, not the same mountaintop. And God is present with them. And somehow, both Elijah and Moses come to stand beside Jesus. Now, there are two other things that happen in this story that are really important. One is the transfiguration itself, which Jesus is transfigured. Mark says that his clothes are changed. They become whiter than any bleach can achieve. But his skin also seems to be glowing. He seems to be emitting this sort of shine of light out of him. Now, Moses had almost the same experience. When he would go up to Mount Sinai to talk with God, often his face would be shining because he was talking face to face with God. So his face would be glowing, and he would come down the mountain, and of course the people who didn't understand what was going on were afraid of what was happening. So sometimes Moses even would put on a veil to block his face so the people couldn't see that it was shining. So this transfiguration is a moment where we see that Jesus is reflecting the light of God, that he has been with God, and somehow that has left a semi-permanent illumination to him. And so Jesus is, in a sense, a new Moses, shining, about to lead them out of some kind of captivity. It's a beautiful image. The second thing that stands out is what happens next. You'll notice that the disciples are saying, well, we should stay here forever. We'll make little dwelling places, almost like sacred little houses for Jesus and Elijah and Moses. So already we see the disciples saying, you're equal to these heroes of the faith now that we see who you are as Messiah and sort of equal and maybe even above Moses and Elijah. After that, though, the voice of God rings out, and they hear it. And just like at Jesus' baptism, when that voice said, "This is my son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased," here in this scene, God echoes that at the Transfiguration. "This is my son, the beloved." But this time he says, "Listen to him." Because Jesus is trying to tell them important things. They're not going to be able to either listen or understand. God's instructing them to listen, but they're going to have a hard time with it. So Jesus' whole self shines. He is at a sort of a new baptism, whereas he was first baptized to go into ministry. Now he is sort of baptized by light to go into the second half of Mark's gospel, the Passion narrative. Now, again, it's important that this happens right after the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. Remember, who do the people say I am, but who do you say I am? And when Peter responds, "You are the Messiah," this scene following up after that is almost like Mark is saying, this is your proof, this is your confirmation. If you wondered if Peter was right, that Jesus is in fact the Messiah sent by God, the Transfiguration serves as sort of a confirmation of that Jesus is exactly who Peter said he is. As we move through the rest of chapter 9 and then into chapter 10, the statement about listening to Jesus is going to be quite noticeable, because Jesus is going to say several times, in the midst of healing people left and right, he's going to be telling them exactly what his mission is as the Messiah. They're not really going to let that sink in. So as we continue in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, we find that Jesus and his disciples are going to start a journey. They've been in the region of the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, in the towns and villages and the great swath of area around it. But now Jesus is going to be transferring his ministry to Judea. What's important to understand is that this happens after the Transfiguration. Again, this is sort of a baptism of light into the second part of his ministry. And so now that that's happened, Jesus is going to start leaving the Galilee and going up to Judea. Judea would be the region of Israel that surrounds the area of Jerusalem, one of the tribal areas of the southern kingdom of Israel that would have been in that region. Now, I say that Jesus and the disciples are going to go up to Jerusalem, but that is going to be geographically south of Galilee. And that might seem a little confusing, but what you have to understand is that Jerusalem is actually on top of a mountain or a very large hill. Jerusalem is actually many, many feet above sea level. If you were to go and visit Israel during the season of May, where you would be in the Dead Sea area or Jericho and it would be in the 90s or 100s, you can sometimes have days in the 70s or 80s in Jerusalem, even though it is very, very close to that area of Jerusalem, just a couple hours of drive away, because of the fact of the elevation of Jerusalem. So when you say you're going up to Jerusalem, no matter where you are in Israel, you are literally going up in terms of altitude to Jerusalem. So the disciples and Jesus have been in the Galilee region near the Sea of Galilee and around it, and they're going up to Jerusalem, going geographically south, around the Jordan in some aspects, and then back across it, going into the areas that we're going to really sort of skirt through today. So we get to Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 32. And this is what I was speaking about a moment ago, about listening to Jesus and not comprehending it. This is one of the predictions of Jesus saying to his disciples what will happen to him as the Messiah, but also at the hands of the leaders of the temple along with the Romans. Now, it's important to know that even though I'm skipping to some of these passages that are of importance, there are other wonderful passages and stories, primarily about healings or teachings, that we just don't have time to go over. So I really hope that you'll spend some time looking through the Gospel of Mark in those areas. So starting with Mark chapter 9, verse 30, here's one of the predictions, the second of three at this point, that Jesus is giving to his disciples. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. So, we continue with that idea of the messianic secret that is so indicative of the Gospel of Mark. Not only does Jesus try to teach them about what's going to happen to him, but he also tells them not to tell anyone. But the second piece of that messianic secret is that the disciples don't understand, and they're too afraid to even ask God what he meant, Jesus, what he meant. So in this sense, we get Jesus being very clear, at least from our perspective, knowing what happens to Jesus, that he is in fact betrayed, he is in fact killed upon a cross, and he is in fact after 3 days raised from the dead. But to the disciples, this did not have anything to do with what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be. A valiant king who would come in and liberate Israel. This dying and being raised on the third day doesn't make any sense. And so you have to wonder if they're so used to Jesus teaching in parables or in confusing ways that they think they should understand, even though he seems to be very succinct, but very clear about what's going to happen. Now, this is again the transition towards the second half of Mark's gospel, that we're moving towards the Passion narrative. And he will then again predict his death a third time. And that's what we're going to jump to in the Gospel of Mark chapter 10, verse 32. Now, again, Jesus is with his disciples. They're traveling. There are healings. There are other things that are happening along the way. They're getting closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. And we're going to jump to Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." Now I'm going to pause right there because that is even more clear, isn't it, about what Jesus is saying that is going to happen to him. Very, very clear and evident. You'll notice that again he says he's going up to Jerusalem. He says the Son of Man, which we've already discussed, is possibly a messianic title that is given to Jesus by himself, saying what's going to happen to him. And notice how the religious leaders are going to all do these things to him, and then they're going to hand him over to the Gentiles, the Romans, and they are then going to dispatch of him. And there's a reason for that, and that was that the capital punishment of death was not given to the Jewish leaders. It was reserved for the Roman Empire itself. They were not going to allow the leaders of Israel to do that. So this is very clear about what Jesus is saying, and still the disciples are not going to fully get it, because we're going to continue and read verses 35 through 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Isn't that a strange question? We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. This is something like a child might say to the parents. I want you to do something, but I want you to promise me first that you're going to do it. And he said to them, Jesus said to James and John, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We're able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." So again, there seem to be thinking about Jesus as a Messiah figure who is going to win and rule Israel, who is going to kick the Romans out, and he is going to lead. And he's going to be, sitting in glory afterwards, that he is going to be celebrated as the great liberator of the people of Israel, sort of like a new Moses, right? But in this sense, they don't understand, because that's not the kind of glory he's going to be sitting in. When he asks, "Can you drink from the cup or be baptized with the baptism I'm going to have?" What he's saying basically is, I just told you I'm going to have to die. I'm going to have to be betrayed and killed, and on the third day I will rise again. The glory that he's going to have is going to be outside of this reality. It's going to be in heaven, sitting at the right hand of the Father. So again, he can't give that to anyone. That's God's to give. But if they want to follow through with following Jesus through death, be martyrs, that's up to them. Now, the rest of the disciples still don't seem to understand this either, because here they go. This is verse 41. When the 10 heard this, they became angry with James and John. It's almost like we should have thought to ask before they did. Verse 42, so Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be the first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus is basically telling them that this push to become the greatest, the push from James and John, and now the jealousy of the others to become the second and third greatest, to sit at his right hand and left hand is not important. In fact, if you want to sit anywhere close to Jesus in glory, the way is not by claiming a spot or by putting down others, it's by serving others. Jesus shows the pathway to be good and to be holy, to be perfect. It has nothing to do with succeeding in the normal way. It has to do with how much we give, how much we sacrifice, how much we tend to the needs of others. Because Jesus is basically saying, I'm a different kind of Messiah. I'm the kind of Messiah who lays down my life for people, not one who leads people into battle. My job is to bring people back to God, not bring independence back to Israel. So Jesus is trying to instruct them that the way of the church, the way of ministry, the way of a Christian is not about who gets to the top. It's about who's ready to kneel, who's ready to serve. It is more blessed to give than to receive. So the next time that you have the opportunity to kneel, I know that many of us are not able to do that because of the current pandemic, but if you get the chance to be able to kneel before God, whether it's in a worship service where you have a kneeler at your pew, or whether it's at the front where there is a communion rail, the times that we get to kneel are an important moment, because at that moment we're understanding the posture that Jesus wants us to have. Not only kneeling before God, but kneeling before others. If you've ever attended a worship service, usually these happen during Holy Week. We do it on Maundy, Thursday at our church, but you may have attended a worship service where you wash the feet of others, just like Jesus washes the feet of the disciples at the Last Supper, according to the Gospel of John. And that position of being a servant is really made clear at that point by Jesus, because he's the rabbi, he's the teacher, he's the one that's leading in the Seder, the Passover Seder, and yet he's the one that kneels down and gets his hands dirty cleaning the feet of the disciples, something that was not to be done because he was the rabbi. They should be washing his feet, just like Peter says. But again, Jesus is trying to teach us, if you want to be great, you have to get on a knee and serve someone else. It's a beautiful image, and one that Christians often forget to practice. At this point, we are almost at the end of the first half of the Gospel of Mark. We've got one more story, and you're probably aware that the Passion narrative, while powerful and while meaningful, is a very somber set of chapters, because this is the story of Jesus giving his life for the world. And there are going to be times where Jesus is going to be rejected. There are going to be scenes in which he is going to suffer greatly. And throughout this story, it's going to be somber. And so it's kind of wise or just beautiful that Mark ends the first half of his gospel right before going into Jerusalem with the story of a healing. And that is blind Bartimaeus, according to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. Here is that final story from Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. This scene takes place in Jericho, very close to the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River is going to finally end up. And so they have sort of followed that down from the Galilee, and now they're about to journey uphill for several miles up to Jerusalem. It's interesting that this story, this healing, happens right before the somber moments. It's an uplifting story. It's about a man who was blind, who was looked over, he was passed aside by all these people in the crowd, but finally he speaks up for himself. He will not be deterred, and he gets the attention of Jesus, and he becomes made well. The other thing that's really interesting about this is that blind Bartimaeus seems to be able to see more clearly than the people with eyesight. And what I mean by that is that he calls him Son of David twice, almost as a reference to him being a Messiah, because the Messiah was understood to come from the roots of the Davidic monarchy, David, Solomon, and others. And so blind Bartimaeus seems to be the one who understands who Jesus is. It's also important that there is a healing of eyesight, to be able to see right before he goes in Jerusalem. It's almost as if Mark is trying to tell us, look closely, don't be spiritually blind to what's about to happen, because we need to see, we need to hear, we need to read, and we need to understand everything that we're about to encounter. So when we come back next week, we're going to be in the second half of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to start in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of Mark and begin our focus on the passion of Jesus Christ. Look forward to seeing you next week.